A very warm good evening. Thank you to the Chamber for the invite. Thank you to John for those tough questions. Ouch. The overview starts with the idea that these are very large assets. I'll start with a few figures to get you going. Some facts. Close to 5 trillion in assets in sovereign wealth funds. 4 motivations for what they need from those funds. First and foremost, finance, return per unit risk. Secondly, economics. Third, there is politics. And fourth, there is a social cause. It's in that order, really. 3 controversies. So legitimacy, transparency, and are they a force for good or not? So I am asking one of John's questions. 2 groups, commodity-based, oil-based, and the non-commodity-based groups. All surplus funds, of course. And then 1 entity, so 60 different organizations trying to be cohesive through the Santiago principles, 24 principles of how to operate. But they do differ very, very substantially. So my journey with sovereign wealth funds is a long one, both in time and distance. So John mentioned I'm the advisor to New Zealand Super Fund, which is the sort of client that you kind of get for penance, given that it takes 26 hours to get out there. But there are compensations insofar as my next meeting with the fund is in 2 weeks' time, just before the England quarter-final against France. So that's what they call good timing. The type of work that I've been doing is very much around strategy and governance. So it actually covers both the aspects of what they do and how they do it. And I am going to stress that quite a lot as I go through. What I really like about the sovereign funds is that they are such a professional group and they know what the right questions are. So let's just help a number of you with the concept. This may be straightforward, it may not be. I know that sovereign funds kind of don't have a very clear press. So from that point of view, think of them as a very large, fast-growing group. But in the context of things, 5 trillion is only 20% of global pension funds. But they're at the shoulder of pension funds in terms of influence because of the large ones in particular that more than punch their weight. They are definitely motivated substantially by this first point, essentially wealth creation and transfer across time. And obviously that implies risk is being handled through that particular transfer and across multiple decades, of course. Their press is very mixed. It has actually somewhat improved, but the misunderstandings about sovereign wealth funds continue to be a major issue. So you can see this particular Economist front page, which actually really sort of makes it a scare story, that their motivations are substantially political. What I'm going to argue is that can be the case, but it generally isn't the case. They are fascinating in the context of the big macro picture, and we'll develop that as we go through this talk. So they really do hold up a mirror on some of the most difficult issues that we face in our current society. And I'm going to argue that these funds should become the pin-ups of the future. They have to, though, perhaps make certain moves in the direction of transparency to become so, because at the moment they are still misunderstood. Well, my work is sort of varied when I've been involved with sovereign funds, and I will give one other example, which is in the public domain, and that is the Australian Future Fund, which is around about the 10th largest sovereign fund in the world, and only came into being around about 6 years ago. Essentially, that particular fund, the involvement that Towers Watson had was to do with the mandate itself. And many of these funds have really quite limited descriptions of what they're supposed to do. But in the case of the Australian Future Fund, partly because of the political pressures of the time, it was actually set up on quite a depolitical basis with a mandate that's very, very clear and is 100% finance, which is to achieve a return round about 5 percentage points above CPI, the local CPI. And so from that point of view, an absolute return investor who has a decade and more before any of its assets are drawn down. And structure there is very away from government. And so it carries a certain independence, which is quite important. Because, of course, these funds can lose their legitimacy quite quickly if governments use them for their own purpose. And so from that point of view, everything was kind of set up pretty well in that case, down to the idea that this fund doesn't actually have directors or trustees. It has guardians. And I think that word describes very much that these are guardians over the intergenerational aspects of how these funds are meant to be set up. So when we talk about the return on mission in a fund like that, we actually have the financial definition at the forefront. And politics is very much limited to, in my view, virtually nothing in this particular situation. Although there are other values which are to do with how it manages its reputation, which I think you would expect. So from that point of view, it's a very, very clear-cut mandate. On another day, I would take you through the whole list, as it were, but I think I just want to dwell a little bit on what's at the foot of the list there, which is the how of decision-taking. And in particular, the factors that organizations like this go through now, when they're relatively modern financial institutions, they have a lot of advantages. And the Future Fund, from a standing start 6 years ago, near enough, when it actually got its first employee, which was actually Paul Costello, the previous CEO of the New Zealand fund. He had that experience of having started up a fund, and he actually transferred that across to the Australian equivalent. And from that point, the design of the organization in terms of how it takes decisions has to be scaled up. And so starting from that standing start without a capability, but building up something that's substantial is the challenge, and keeping it agile and not allowing the growth of the team, which has got to 60 or 70 people over that period of time, to kind of weigh it down. You need that bandwidth of ability, but at the same time, you kind of need to keep the cohesiveness and the focus. So a lot of literature in the human capital research that demonstrates that teams of about 50 or 60 are kind of optimal, you know, for our sense of belonging to a group, belonging to a club, and not feeling too lost in the crowd. So from that point of view, that sort of size has worked very well. But there are many issues about how to organize decision-making in the investment world. I'm arguing that some of these funds that are new have many advantages. When you actually look at some of the ways that pension funds generally, which have been around for longer, are organized, there are a number of deficiencies in that type of model.